Hello and welcome to a brand new show of IRM, the show on which we debate, ideate and discuss that what needs to be done so that India can really come back on the growth track. The world is suffering with pandemic, GDP has got crushed, but there are some sectors which have really evolved and blossomed. There are some companies which have become stronger, but in generally, what can be done to rekindle demand and to generate optimism back, both at the consumer level and also at the corporate level. So to discuss all that and much more with me, it gives me great pleasure to bring on board Venkatram, CEO of Deloitte India. Venkat, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Venkat, when we met and spoke last, the COVID pandemic was at its peak. The fear was at its peak. The mood was, in a sense, very shaky. In your assessment, now are things looking up? Has bad become better or bad still remains bad?
Well, I think that the bad has become better, but it hasn't peaked out yet. So we still need to be cautiously optimistic. So I wouldn't rush back, for example, to work tomorrow as a consequence. But certainly I do think that, when we talked about the last time, the balance between life and livelihood, the time has come when we have to now look in terms of how we get back to the revive mode and look in terms of how the economy can go forward. A lot of steps have been taken thus far, and I think, reopening the economy is really the logical next step that we have to take very seriously, both as a government and as individuals and as businesses.
Venkat, a lot of companies are telling us that they are back to pre-COVID demand in terms of both in terms of their business as well as their channel checks are indicating that. Should we take that with a pinch of salt? Do you think this is just the sugar rush after the lockdown, or you think genuinely things have changed for auto, for steel, consumer durables and white goods?
Well, I think eventually many other sectors will also emerge as winners. The truth is there is a lot of pent-up demand. The reality is that India has been in lockdown for many months now. We are all looking in terms of getting back to what we would call a more normal way of life. So whether I look at retail, whether I look at automotive, I look at fashion, all these are going to come back. I don't believe that we need to worry about demand anymore. As I said in the very beginning, I think the real issue is what do we set as the task for ourselves as the next normal? Because while things will get better, we've also got habituated in this period to a certain way of life. For example, we've started this process of work from home. We've also looked in terms of cost reductions. We've also looked in terms of managing with less. Some of these good practices, particularly the conservation of cash, are things we should continue to do when life turns back to normal.
Has the ability, Venkat, of the consumer to hold on and to generate demand, has that surprised you? Because anecdotal data seems to be indicating that.
Not at all. In fact, I think even on the white goods side, I think there has been quite a spurt in demand. The consumer has not surprised me at all. As I said, a lot of this is pent-up demand that is coming back, and there is more to come. I don't think, this is just loosening of the purse strings for a short period of time. I think, yes, people have a reallocation of priorities, but one of its priorities is certainly to live life to its fullest.
Now, Venkat, there is a huge adaptation, digital migration. Satya Nadella said at a public forum that companies which had planned a process of digital migration in next 3 years, what they planned for next 3 years, it actually is happening in 3 months now. What is your view? You think digital migration has got fast-tracked? If yes, it is here to stay, or this is just going to be a one-time process and then things will flatter back?
Well, I think that early into the pandemic, one of the greatest areas of opportunity was in the digitization or virtualization of companies, as we would say. And so, you talked about the car industry, for example. The question is, how can you sit at home and purchase a motor car? How do you get that virtual experience that you are walking in a showroom, having a touch and feel of the car? The second important thing was to understand behaviors. The amount of analytics that you would use, the amount of data that you would process has increased very vastly. You've also seen during this pandemic that there have been certain large M&A deals in this area as well. So I think digitization, data, analytics, all of this has certainly accelerated, and perhaps, the job of a few years has happened in a few months. But this has to be sustainable. It's something that now is more affordable. We've also got to see how we sustain that as companies, whilst we are cautious because we are looking at the short term and saying, what's going to happen? How do I survive this quarter? We've also got to invest in some of these transformational changes, which we will require when the economy opens up completely. So I think that as a company, as a corporate, I would urge them to look not only short term, but to also look at the longer term. And certainly the virtualization, digitization journey is one of the longer term investments they have to make. That's the new India. That's the next normal.
Where do you think the scars of the pandemic, in which sector, which part of the economy are going to be hard, and the scars will be permanent?
Well, we've already seen the scars, right? I mean, if you look at the hospitality industry, it will come back in some shape or form, but certainly they will bear the battle scars. Construction industry has also faced a lot of difficulty. I am happy with the sort of steps that are being taken, particularly on the realty side. But certainly, I think that the construction industry is one which will have to have a rethink of how they look at their own future. The retail industry, again, will bounce back, but will rethink the way in which they actually sell on brick and mortar. They will have to look more in terms of how they also sell on the internet, for example. So each industry is going to redefine itself and have an alternative mechanism to work, not because we're expecting another pandemic, but because we've all realized that there are new and improved and more efficient ways in which we can run businesses.
You spoke about digitization, Venkat. So my question is that while digitization and adaptation is great, what this may actually do is that with the use of AI and digitization, a lot of processes would change, and that eventually could lead to a huge job loss also.
Well, I think that that's a very narrow interpretation of how we would look at digitization. I think that when you look at even automating, it has to be intelligent automation. It's also a question of how it creates demand. Some of us who are old-timers would remember the strikes that were there in all the public sector banks in the 70s when they looked in terms of automating their systems, right? It didn't mean that it stymied the number of new people who were employed by the banks. So the reality is there are new types of jobs that will come up. And I certainly do think when you look at the future of jobs, a lot of the jobs will be shorter-term jobs, they'll be fixed-term jobs. And there, if I may just perhaps take the cue from that and congratulate the government on what they've done on the labor code, I think that is a very path-breaking reform that has taken place, recognizing fully that in a digital economy, you will have people who will have shorter job durations, and it gives you a lot more flexibility. So yes, things will change. You may not have employment as we knew it, to say that you join at the age of 22 and retire at the age of 60, but certainly there will be great opportunities for people who are willing to reskill themselves every few years in this new digital economy. But let us not think or fool ourselves that in India it's only about digital, right? I mean, if you really look at it, Nikunj, we've got the agricultural sector where there has again been a lot of reform, and I would still press to say that more of us should look in terms of investing in, say, food processing and secondary processing in the agricultural sector. That's a great area in which I think India can make progress. On manufacturing, again, you touched upon auto, but there are so many other sectors, particularly the areas which are being opened up when we are aspiring to get on in a bigger way into the global supply chains, such as engineering goods, etc., where we will create employment. Finally, I would also say that we should not forget our services industry. And within services, I would call out IT and ITES. And I called it out because that was a sector which after Y2K got so much support from the government and actually grew to what it is today. Great generator of employment. And today, frankly, a factory in which a lot of the work across the world is being done. So they will continue to generate jobs, and I also do believe that they will be the engines of growth for other companies within India. But if you want true employment as I see it, beyond the digital economy, I would think, Nikunj, we have to look at the MSME sector. There is absolutely no doubt that that sector has taken the biggest beating in the crisis. And even before that, people used to sometimes jokingly say that it is still a nation of small, that we don't have enough medium-sized enterprise.
So Venkat, let's talk about the two reforms which the government currently has just introduced. One is agri and second is labor. What are your thoughts on both?
Well, I did touch upon both. Agri, I mean, it's not really my area of expertise. But I do understand, the issue of farm gate and the fact that when we're looking in terms of e-pricing, etc., these are all steps forward. But the one which I really am excited about is food processing, the question of setting up mega parks, and a little flexibility in terms of what you call a mega park as to where you can invite some of the largest producers in the world to come in. Look at India as a country. I mean, I think the only hurdle that we have to using food, which is food processed, is that it's processed food. But short of that, if we are able to get past that mental block that there is a processing done of the food that we eat, there is so much that we produce which can be more hygienically packed and more widely distributed. It can be used for everything, including even your midday meal scheme, right? So I think India is a country that is ripe for food processing. It also brings with it all the other ancillaries. You can look in terms of setting up the machinery manufacturing units. We can also look in terms of how it becomes a major area of export for us. So I think that agricultural reform per se is good, but it can be made even better if we get to the secondary processing area as well. When I look at labor reforms, I am a little surprised personally that it didn't pick up much press or much comment. I sometimes think that, these are areas which industry has been clamoring for a long time about. And even when you look at the ease of business, doing business index, I think we were below 100 on the area of labor, and this should pull us up substantially. I believe the multinationals, again, will look at this very favorably when they look in terms of making investment in India, and they will find that we are a very favorable investment destination. So, yes, I think it's good. A lot of this actually then finally dovetails into the ease of doing business, where I think we are about 68 out of, I forget, I think it's over 130 odd countries. But the reality is that three areas still need more work. One is on land reform. It's not that work is not being done, but still availability of land and the ease with which you can use the land are still important concerns for industry, because it increases the gestation period when you set up something. We have had greenfield in very, very small doses in this country over the last few years. A large part of it has been brownfield. Some of the major investments in recent times have actually been through the bankruptcy code, where people have bought businesses that have already been built that went bankrupt, which were large businesses. We would like to see more people who were like what in the old days we call the industrialists, people who actually built businesses from the ground up.
But Venkat, ultimately it comes down to risk appetite and the mood of corporates. Who will do heavy lifting? India's biggest corporate, Reliance, which has the ability to manage debt and create asset out of taking loans, is in the process of deleveraging. Tatas are deleveraging. So my question is that if large corporate houses who understand risk and who always participate in a downtrend, they are currently deleveraging. So who will do the heavy lifting?
Well, when you look at it from one angle, and the angle at which you are looking at it, there is some truth in it, because if I would look at the accumulated profits of corporate India over the last few years, it has certainly been depleted. And even for some of the stronger corporates, there is no doubt that the coffers have got depleted during the times of COVID. So yes, if you look at accumulated profits, the absence of reserves from which you can rebuild, the fact that many of the companies are highly leveraged, and will not be thinking in terms of building new businesses. You will have to look at how do you broad-base entrepreneurship in this country. It will require capital, and I think technology as well. And when I talk about technology, it's manufacturing technology. So within what India as a country wants to do of being Atmanirbhar, we have to also bear in mind the concept that it is how we become self-reliant, and that it doesn't mean that it is without taking the help and assistance of others. We will need outside investment. We will need external investment in order to build. We will need to have a very strong, sustained export market. But some of these things realistically are going to take time to get to. We may even talk about the fact that the banks itself, if I look at our own banking system, have enough funds that they have not disbursed, and they would be happy to disburse funds to people who have the right knowledge and the right pedigree. Perhaps what we need to see is that the levels of governance in this country improve so that we can nurture a new set of entrepreneurs as well, who are looking at taking funds from the bank, not really as part of equity, but with a genuine intent to return the debt. I think this country has suffered long for the huge amount of non-performing assets that are on the books of our banks. And there is going to be one big cleanup that will happen now. And we should not perpetuate this in our enthusiasm to build new business. But I think there is sufficient entrepreneurship in India. We probably need some outside funding, because especially when I look at infrastructure build, regardless of the fact that the government is putting in and has committed a lot of money into infrastructure, you will need to look in terms of how some other foreign capital also comes in. It's probably also good for our markets, it's good for our exchange rate and everything else. But most realistically, this is a journey on which we can't walk alone. The time is right, with all the geopolitical environment that's going on, coupled with the fact that we are genuinely coming across the country that now wants to privatize and give the private sector primacy over the public sector. The fact that we are opening up parts of our economy, we're opening up areas like defense, etc., which in the past we would never have allowed external investment. We should now therefore look in terms of how we can capitalize on this, coupled with consistent, repeated efforts to reduce the time it takes to set up business and look for funding. But you can't do this on our own. I think the reality is that India will have to take assistance of its friends overseas as well.
Let's talk about manufacturing, Venkat. Electronics manufacturing in India, moving off pharma supply chain on the API front, focus back on essential categories like auto and ancillary, even footwear, furniture. Do you think this is India's India's renaissance moment in manufacturing? Because the challenge for the manufacturing sector were three: land, labor, and cost of capital. And at least the labor and the cost of capital seems to be getting.
Yeah, as I said, land, I think the government says it's getting more available, but when you look at the sort of industries you have described, it's more in terms of how we create the successful clusters. It's not that India hasn't done it in the past. We've done it for hosiery, for example, very successfully. I think we have to create these clusters. We have to also create these land corridors. And this is where I say the medium-sized enterprises can also play a larger role. So we should, yes, look more in terms of doing that. I think India is ripe for that. Perhaps one area in the ease of doing business I didn't mention earlier, which will become important, is logistics. I do believe that we have made great strides in logistics, but there's a report on logistics which talked about the fact that we are ranked about 44 in the world on logistics against China's 23 or 24. So I'm presuming there's a lot of scope for growth on that. So yes, if we get logistics right, and if we are able to create an environment, a cluster in which like-minded companies in similar industries are able to prosper and thrive, that is the right way to go about it. And I'm pretty sure that the funding and financing will also be made available.
Venkat, what is your view on the big tech war which is happening? India has banned Chinese apps. There is definitely a backlash in America also against data. The government of India clearly is now talking about data protection and data enhancement for local users rather than data being shared by global users. Is the tech war real? Is it here to stay? What implications this could have on India in terms of future investment?
Well, there are two parts to the tech war, right? I mean, one is in terms of technology per se and whether you will have technology standards that are defined by the West vis-a-vis the technology standards that are defined by China. I think that in itself is a long conversation and I think a large opportunity for India because I'm sure that India will be sitting on the right side of that one. When I look at the other things which are going on in terms of blocking on the internet, or when I look in terms of data per se, I believe that as one of the most populous countries in the world, we are actually sitting on a gold mine. And we need to rethink. I mean, we think about it a lot, but we need to again keep thinking about how we can use this for the public good. There surely has to be a method by which, if others are mining that data, for example, to look at how they can do a betterment of health or curtailment of disease, how can that information, which somebody has probably bought for and used, also the findings be shared on some basis with the governments themselves? Because I don't think it's right to restrict use of data or to set such tight data privacy laws that we're all nervous about what we look at or even to turn the page. But we should see how the harnessing of that data is used for a larger public good. And I think that's where we need to spend a little more time, because otherwise all that's going to happen is we're going to get exploited again. A lot of the data that comes out of countries like India will be used by other countries to their results that it yields.
So Venkat, at Deloitte, where are you telling companies where should they start investing? Because investing capital or investment is about positioning your capital to in cash or to capitalize from future returns or future trends in the industry or on the consumer side. Where should one be investing?
Well, I think as I was mentioning earlier, the issue is that when this say quarter tak, how do you get past this quarter to the next quarter? How do you preserve your cash flows? What is the cadence that you follow with your employees? How you tell them the jobs are still safe, etc., etc. That also meant in terms of how you pay them, how you reward them, how you incentivize them. I think when we get to revive and thrive, the first thing that we've got to look at is our workforce itself. Because sometimes in all this, we have ignored the aspect of mental wellness as well. Working from home is not easy, and it can play strange tricks at times. So I think if any of us thinking that when things get back to normal, that all our employees are only going to stay with us, we probably are in for a rude shock. So I think, even before I look in terms of investment in plant and machinery, I would say the first investment I would make is in human capital. Look at the human capital and see whether you've done the right things to retain your employees and how you reward them for the sacrifices that even they have made during this period of crisis. Thereafter, you have to look in terms of how you build a more virtual organization. A virtual organization, I hasten to add, does not necessarily mean the jobs go away. I would also say that digitization does not mean that you merely replicate something that is done manually in another shape or form. There's a lot more intelligent thinking that would go into what you transform the business into. So there will be investments in technology, there will be investments in people, and there will be investments in your plant and machinery. But the big challenge that I have is, who is going to invest in new areas? Who is going to invest in food processing? Who is going to say that, look, I want to serve this domestic market to a quality by which I become a global supplier in the global supply chain? I think those are fewer people who will do, And these are the companies which will go to the banks and say, please open the doors for us and fund us. And perhaps those conversations should start.
Well, Venkat, really appreciate your time. Thank you so very much for joining us with your thoughts, and thank you for your inputs. That's it on this edition of India Revival Mission. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for watching the Times Network.